This is our fourth and last PowerPoint on World War II, and it's fitting that we take a look at the war in the Pacific, which is, of course, primarily the United States against the forces of the Empire of Japan, because, of course, it was the Japanese that got the United States involved in World War II by attacking the United States at Pearl Harbor. So it's fitting that we look at this as the last one. In addition to the battlefield, we're also looking at what was happening at home, a very critical project that would not only change the ending of the war, but would also change the world. In addition, we also have the last meeting of the three allies as the war begins to come to an end. But first, there was still the war to fight. Now, of course, this was happening. A lot of what we're looking at right now is happening at the same time that the war is raging on in Europe. Literally at the same time as the Japanese were carrying out their attack on Pearl Harbor, they were also carrying out or planning to carry out an attack on various other islands in the Pacific. The idea was that a lightning strike, not only kind of a sucker punch to the United States' military at Pearl Harbor, but also a very quick strike into various territories in and around the Pacific. The idea was, of course, that if they managed to take control of this very expansive area covering much of the Pacific Ocean quickly, then even if the United States were able to respond, they would not be able to dislodge or get rid of the Japanese as they dug in, almost like ticks on a dog, in these dinky little islands. And it would be on these little islands that the majority of World War II in the Pacific would be fought. It would be fought on these tiny little island territories, many of which you've never heard of. Now, one of the key strategic areas that the Japanese do take, at least at the very beginning of the war, are the Philippine Islands. And of course, that is a primary target because there is, however small, a contingent of American military stationed there. And it was this force in the Philippine Islands, commanded by Douglas MacArthur, that the Japanese had to get rid of in order to get to oil reserves down in Southeast Asia. And of course, oil, no longer coming from the United States, was a critical natural resource that the Japanese needed to, of course, maintain their vast new mechanized military. Not all, obviously, for fuel, but also to maintain all the machinery in this new military that the Japanese had built up rather rapidly. And so you see the Japanese strike not only at the Philippines, but they strike at places like Wake Island, Bataan, Corregidor. Those are actually Philippine islands, but at various other locations in and around the Pacific. Now, at this time, the American Navy, which of course had been majorly damaged at the in the Pearl Harbor attack, were trying to find ways of striking back. Now, what's interesting about Pearl Harbor is that amongst all of the damaged ships that you would find at Pearl Harbor right after December 7th, you would not find a single aircraft carrier. These are these huge flat-top ships off of which you could fly planes clear out at sea. And the reason why was because all the American aircraft carriers that were stationed in the Pacific had left Pearl Harbor just a few days before the Japanese had attacked. And therefore, they had avoided any damage inflicted during the Pearl Harbor attack, which meant the United States had all their carriers. This dramatically changed the strategy in the Pacific because the Americans now had to rely primarily on their carrier fleet. And these ships, which could extend the power of the Navy far beyond the range of any gun, because of course you had planes, and they could fly, they could fly miles and miles and miles and miles away, versus a gun that could shoot maybe 20 or 30 miles away, whereas these ships could fly a lot farther than that, carrying bombs, and of course destroying the other side's naval planes, which of course the Japanese had used to attack Pearl Harbor. So this now became a war very quickly of battling navies, battling Navy forces, naval forces, either the Navy themselves or the Marines, which were transported by the Navy. One of the big turning points in the war was a place called Midway. The Japanese decided that they were going to launch one more massive strike against the Americans. Little did the Japanese know the Americans had cracked their code and knew everything that they were saying. And as a result, they knew that they were headed for this Midway Island group, these two little islands. Midway literally is midway between the Japanese islands and Hawaii. And this became a very critical point. The Americans were able to lay a trap at Midway, making the Japanese think that the American Navy was in one place when it really was another. This was under the command of Chester Nimitz, one of the American admirals of the Navy. And he essentially was able to lay this trap and ambush the bulk of the Japanese fleet. These would end up being most of the carriers that had been used to destroy Pearl Harbor were then destroyed at Midway. So Midway becomes this major turning point in the war. Now that essentially the Americans had the Japanese Navy on the run, it was now time to start invading the actual territories that the Japanese had taken. And this was going to mean a painstakingly bloody, tedious battle, island by island by island. Some of these dinky little islands you never heard of. The video footage that we'll watch later this week are going to mention some island names you never heard of. Places like Peleliu or this Guadalcanal, and some of these really weird names. These islands literally were previously uninhabited little territories that the Japanese came in, set up a small base, more importantly a air base from which they could fly planes to harass the American Navy as they came close into this area. And the American Marines were basically sent out into these islands one at a time to utterly destroy the Japanese forces there. Now, here's an important note to take, and you guys will see this also in the video footage that we'll watch later this week, if you are listening to this earlier in the week. And that is that the Japanese were not the Germans. The Japanese were not going to surrender. It was not in that culture of theirs to surrender. There's very much that samurai tradition within the Japanese soldier to not surrender to an enemy. And so the Americans quickly realized that they were literally going to have to kill every single one of them because the Japanese weren't going to surrender. Even when they were faced with overwhelming odds against them, they were not going to surrender. And as a result, it was going to be very costly to the American Marines and American Navy, person by person, ship to ship, plane to plane, on each one of these battles. It was going to be a battle to the finish. And they quickly realized this. Two of the key islands that they ended up taking was Iwo and Okinawa. Okinawa being some of the worst fighting in World War II. Iwo Jima, of course, being the famous place where the flag that was raised in the Pacific took place. At the same time that the Marines were landing on so many of these little specks of land throughout the Pacific, the American Air Force, based out of some of the islands that the Americans had already taken, were beginning to launch bombing raids on Tokyo. This was actually one of the goals of the island hopping campaign that we saw mentioned in the previous slide. The goal was eventually to take islands that were close enough to the Japanese mainland to where the Americans could actually use the airfields that the Japanese had already built on some of these islands, possibly expand them so they could accommodate larger American planes, such as the new American strategic bomber called the B-29 or the Super Fortress or Stratofortress. And then, of course, to launch those bombers from those islands and bomb the main islands of Japan. And essentially what the Americans were doing was they were terror bombing. They were bombing civilian targets, and there were firestorms that would sweep through different cities in Japan, such as its capital, Tokyo. And the idea was to literally try and scare them into surrendering. And it cost, thousands of lives. It was also intending on destroying industrial and military targets as well. But the idea was to get close enough and start bombing the Japanese islands, and hopefully, bomb them into surrendering. But the Japanese were not going to give up. I mean, we're talking here this happening as late as 1945, which by this time it was pretty obvious to the Japanese military that it really was only a matter of time. And the only reason why the Japanese were continuing to fight on was because the Japanese military were still dominated by people who believed in that old cultural belief left over from the feudal age dominated by the samurai that you don't surrender. Surrender is seen as a dishonor. To give up to an enemy is just considered unconscionable. It's unthinkable, something that you just can't do. What the Japanese didn't know was that by this time the Americans were in the process of developing a weapon that eventually wasn't really going to give them a choice. And we're, of course, talking about the atomic bomb. As early as 1939, there were scientists who were experimenting with splitting a uranium atom. Uranium is an element, and when the atom is an atom of a single atom of uranium is split, it becomes extremely unstable and can release an immense amount of energy. Albert Einstein actually sent a letter off to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, saying, "Look, now I just got out of Nazi Germany." Albert Einstein was a German Jew, and he got out of Germany, and he warned Roosevelt. He said, "Roosevelt," and he said this pretty much straightforward in a letter. He basically said, "Look, they're already thinking about how to do this in Germany, which means if you don't make one, they're going to make one, and they're going to drop it somewhere here in the United States. Which city do you really want to see leveled?" And for a while, Roosevelt resisted. He didn't want to do that. But when that letter came to him from Einstein, that was what convinced him. And of course, the beginning of the war shifted this project in an incredible amount of secrecy into full gear. It was codenamed the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was the American effort to design and build an atomic bomb. And not just one that you could, experiment with in the deserts of New Mexico, which is where the Manhattan Project was located. No, it was an effort to also be able to replicate that experiment in a tactical version of the bomb, meaning something that could be carried on a plane and dropped on a target. Now, the interesting thing about the Manhattan Project, and this is something that you guys definitely want to get down as you listen to this. Initially, the atomic bomb was designed to be dropped on Germany because Germany, like we saw at the beginning of World War II, was seen as the larger threat. And of course, because Einstein had warned that Germany may be developing one themselves. But of course, May of 1945 rolls around, Germany surrenders. There's no need to drop them on Germany. So what's the other Axis power left that the United States is still fighting? Japan. Robert Oppenheimer was the scientist who was the head of the project located at Los Alamos in New Mexico. And it was in the summer of 1945, in fact, July 16th, 1945, in New Mexico, where the first successful test of an atomic bomb was carried out. This was an incredible event. People as far as 60 miles away could see the fireball. Soldiers 15 miles away from ground zero were actually blown off their feet. There were people that were actually that close. So, I mean, think about it. My house is located somewhere between about 15, 20 miles away from Arroyo Valley High School. So imagine if the bomb went off at the high school and me standing just on the ground, clear over here, almost 20 miles away, the shock wave from that blast would bowl me over. It wouldn't kill me, but it would kind of, just knock me off my feet because of the shock wave. And it was absolutely devastating as far as what they thought this thing was going and did do. It vaporized the tower that the test version of the bomb was actually sitting on. There was nothing left of it for about half a mile, extending out from the blast point. The sand in the desert was heated so high from the blast that it was turned to glass. I mean, it really was an amazing feat of science. Years later, Robert Oppenheimer, trying to get out the name here, Robert Oppenheimer was quoted as saying, "I am death, the destroyer of worlds." And yet here he was the one who had created this awesome weapon for the American military. And so at this point, the Americans now just simply have to create a version of this that can be dropped tactically from a plane. And that was done pretty soon. At this point, the bomb is being designed and assembled and eventually is sent off on a ship called the USS Indianapolis, where it's delivered to the island of Tinian. At the same time that the United States is successfully testing an atomic bomb, the three allies get together in Potsdam. This is in Germany. This is after Germany has surrendered. And the big three get together. Now, of course, by this time, President Roosevelt has passed away. His vice president, Harry S. Truman, has now become president. And you also have Winston Churchill, and then, of course, Joseph Stalin from the Soviet Union. However, in the meantime, the names actually change. Churchill is actually voted out of office and is replaced by a man by the name of Clement Attlee. And so the faces have changed literally in the middle of this meeting. And one of the things that they discuss at this third and last meeting of the big three is they, first of all, decide that Japan, like Germany, had to unconditionally surrender at the end of the war. Um, the demand also basically said, if you refuse, you're going to be totally wiped off the face of the planet. I encourage you to read the quote from Harry S. Truman on the assignment for Big Fat Notebook. It is chilling. He basically says, if you reject this offer, we will drop on you enough bombs, the like of which God has never seen on earth. I mean, the words that he uses are quite chilling. However, one little alteration at this point is that they demand the surrender of the Japanese military, not the entire country of Japan. To the Japanese military, this seems like a very cowardly gesture. In fact, this alteration, which the Americans and the Allies had done purposefully to allow the Japanese to keep their emperor, to keep their traditional form of government, actually backfires. And the Japanese basically say, oh, because they're not asking our government to surrender, they must be losing their nerve. They must be losing their cool. They're close to losing the war. All we have to do is hold on. And the Japanese military basically turn around and say, we are not going to even dignify this offer from the big three coming out of the Potsdam meeting with even a response. Now, another interesting thing to note at this meeting is that at this meeting, Truman decides to share with his allies the success of the first military use of an atomic bomb. And what's interesting about that is that apparently Stalin didn't think much of it. He said, well, good luck. As it turns out, most likely the Soviet Union had spies in the Manhattan Project, and he already knew that the Americans had successfully tested this weapon. But now, as you guys have seen here, we have the ultimate test. On August 6th, 1945, the B-29 named the Enola Gay after the pilot's mother, a man by the name of Paul Tibbets. His mother's name was Enola Gay. He named the B-29 that. On August 6th, they dropped the first use of an atomic weapon in war on the town of Hiroshima. One of the reasons why they picked Hiroshima was because it was a military target, but it was a military target that had not yet been bombed in a conventional sense. Basically, it was left untouched. And the reason why the American military had done that was primarily to see the full effect of the atomic bomb. They were setting Hiroshima up. And the initial blast vaporized over 80,000 people. Over 60,000 people came down with deadly radiation related diseases, and they would die. The total death toll from the Hiroshima bombing, from the initial blast to those that would die of various radiation-related diseases afterwards, would total somewhere over 200,000 people. Now, because of this massive loss of life, the bombing in Hiroshima has given a lot of historians cause to debate whether or not this was something that should have been done. One of the reasons why Truman decides to use the bomb at Hiroshima is because at the same time this bombing is being planned, Douglas MacArthur, who had been in command of the Philippine Islands, had after that retreated to the country of Australia, and then in the years since launched another attack, retaking the island of the Philippines, and was in command of a lot of the armed army forces in the Pacific. And his plan was to invade the island of Japan. And because of how terrible the fighting had gotten, the American estimates of how many casualties it would cost America in landing and fighting on the Japanese mainland was in the millions. 1.5 million casualties is what they were expecting. And so Truman decides, no, we're going to shortcut this a little bit, and we're going to use this new technology that we have. Now, what's interesting, as you guys are seeing right here, there was a second bomb dropped on the island of Nagasaki. The reason was because even after Hiroshima, the Japanese refused to surrender. In fact, the mayor of the town, after being given some words to say by the Japanese military, basically told the survivors of Hiroshima that the bomb was the result of a terrible experiment by the Americans, and that they just had to push on. They just had to keep fighting. And as a result, the Japanese did not surrender. And as a result, the Japanese did not surrender after the initial bombing. And Truman basically warned, if you don't, we're going to drop another one, and another one, and another one. The second bomb was dropped on a town called Nagasaki. What's interesting is it actually didn't land exactly where they wanted it to. It actually landed in a valley some about a mile or so away from the town, but because of the force of the blast, it destroyed the town anyway, with the same devastating effects. It was at this time that the Emperor of Japan, who at this time was basically little more than a figurehead, but in certain times he could assert his power and basically say, okay, I'm stepping in and now I'm taking over. And he essentially told the Japanese military leaders, I understand the whole idea of not surrendering, but here's a little interesting factoid that we might want to take a look at and might consider. If we don't surrender, there won't be a Japan to surrender, because they're going to wipe it off the face of the planet. And so in a very practical move, Emperor Hirohito decides that enough is enough, and that Japan would in fact surrender. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced that Japan would in fact surrender in accordance with the provisions handed down by the three allies during the Potsdam Declaration. A formal surrender was done on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri. The Missouri today is docked in Pearl Harbor, where it watches over the remains of one of the ships destroyed in Pearl Harbor called the USS Arizona. The little interesting story here, once our current situation is lifted, and hopefully one day you guys will get to go there, there is a battleship in the port of Los Angeles called the USS Iowa. The Iowa was the ship that this surrender was supposed to take place on, except for one thing. President Truman was born in the state of Missouri. So when it came time for the surrender to be signed, he commanded that it take place on the ship that bears the name of his home state. So that's a little piece of trivia that you might want to consider if you ever get to see the USS Iowa right here in Southern California. September 2nd, 1945 marks the end of World War II and the most destructive conflict the world has ever seen up to this point. It saw it with the use of two nuclear weapons being used. The nuclear weapons were used for a number of reasons. One, to cut the war short. Two, to perhaps keep the Soviet Union from entering into the Pacific. The United States, coming to the end of World War II, was already very distrustful of what Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union's intentions for the rest of the world after World War II, really were. And as a result of the use of these two bombs, the rest of the world also saw what the United States was capable of. And in combination with the use of these two weapons and the growing distrust between two former, albeit difficult but necessary allies during this great war, we would see, starting almost immediately after the end of World War II, another war, a very different kind of war that would last for almost 45 years, something called the Cold War. All right, folks, at this time, make sure that you guys are finishing up your summaries. If you guys are listening to this, and hopefully you all are, we may or may not listen to this during class time. The summaries really are kind of an Achilles heel of a lot of people. A lot of people do the notes, but they don't do the summary, or they don't do it enough or to a satisfactory amount. Please make sure that you write a full paragraph covering any or all three of these topics. Now, you don't, if this PowerPoint covers all three of these topics, doesn't mean you have to write 3 paragraphs. You just have to write one full paragraph that includes something from all 3 of these topics, or just one of them, or 2 of them, that is covered in this PowerPoint. So please make sure that you do that once you finish today's notes.